I am New York.
Я сам Нью-Йорк.
I am New York.
Yo soy Nueva York.
Sono New York.
Je suis New York.
Welcome to DiverseCITY, where we explore New York's eclectic enclaves, one neighborhood at a time. I'm Savitch-Lew, coming to you from quarantine. This month, we're going to take you into Hell's Kitchen, the Manhattan community that extends from 34th Street in the south to 59th Street in the north, between 8th Avenue and the Hudson River. The area's name is legendary, like something out of myth or epic poetry. The neighborhood's grid has made it the backdrop to many films and television series, including the recent Netflix hit series featuring Marvel Comics' blind vigilante superhero Daredevil. But the distinctly named district has been going through a bit of a controversial rebranding. Some realtors now want the area to be called Chelsea North. There are also complaints of a growing homeless population in the neighborhood. And that's just one issue being compounded by the coronavirus. On this episode, we're not okay. More New Yorkers struggling with mental illness during the pandemic. Times are changing. How a community group plans on bringing back the neighborhood that's come to epitomize New York City. And the grit and the glam, covering Hell's Kitchen during its transition. Those stories and more coming up on DiverseCITY. West 42nd Street magazine was created nearly 7 years ago when Hell's Kitchen was going through a transition from gritty to glam. The publication highlights neighborhood news while welcoming newcomers and giving bragging rights to old-timers. Flip through the pages of West 42nd Street magazine and you will find a combination of profiles and features that show how much Hell's Kitchen has changed.
It used to be awful, had the Westies, the Irish gangs, so that was really 7 years ago where it was. But I could see that it was coming up.
Phil O'Brien moved to the U.S. from the U.K. 7 years ago after leaving a very successful career as a photojournalist. He started the East Midlands Picture Service in the U.K., a news photography agency that rivaled Getty.
Over 20 years, I was a news photographer there. And then when I got a passport when I was 25, it became a sports photography agency and started to travel the world. And over time, when the Getty family came into photography and started buying lots of things, and Getty Images became big, we were eventually their biggest competitor in Europe, and we sold, after 20 years, to the Press Association, the equivalent of Associated Press.
I love Hell's Kitchen and everything about it. And I loved it so much that I decided 2 years ago to start a magazine, imaginatively called West 42nd Street. And Ruth's the editor, and she joined in January 2015.
Now, he works with one other reporter on the free magazine that's distributed to luxury buildings, hotels, coffee shops, and other small businesses in Hell's Kitchen.
The most people we have in terms of our readership are 25 to 45. We also have, in the area, there's 30% of our audience identifies LGBTQ+, but I'd really say that's predominantly gay males. I'd say probably 29% of that. So it's a special area in terms of that, because New York, you'd have typically thought that the biggest gay population was in the Village. It moved up to Chelsea. Now it's Hell's Kitchen.
O'Brien says the 30,000 circulation paper has had some success, but the COVID-19 pandemic could jeopardize that. They suspended publication on March 13th and have since taken to publishing the magazine as a newsletter sent via email.
We say we just want to continue to connect people, we want to update people, and we want to be upbeat. And we want it to be a friend dropping into the inbox every morning. You feel, oh, what's happening in the neighborhood? And no more.
At a time when, everybody and their mother is saying print media is dead, why decide to do a magazine and not just keep it online from the very beginning?
Just because I'm totally mad. I think it was, I like it as an artifact. So I think what we found were, there's a lot of people in rental apartments who've just arrived and they've got nothing on the walls. They're worried about, because it's a rental apartment, what they can do with the place. They have few bits of furniture. And what we found, people love these. They just, it's like their artifact they can put out that gives them pride. It's in their area, it's pretty. So people collect them.
Aside from adding to an apartment's aesthetic, O'Brien says the paper's also about doing some hand-holding for newcomers.
So even the first magazines were always about giving people bragging rights. Oh, did you know this is down the road? Oh, we've just got this theatre and this person lives here. So it was a pride in the area, a community, and we've always wanted to connect those people. So the old and the new visitors, like I was, a new person coming to the States. I wanted to feel that I could make this home, be connected, find a way of navigating what can be a lonely town.
Always a maverick, O'Brien is already thinking of lowering his circulation numbers in an effort to change his distribution model. A tough spot for a publication that depends on advertising to keep the presses printing. So do you have any intention, do you have any idea as to when you may begin the printing process again?
Yeah, our target is August. We will probably change the model. We're likely to start to charge for the magazine. And the magazine would then, you would either buy on subscription, or if you're in one of the bigger buildings, we've already had indications the bigger buildings that stockers will be like, okay, we'll buy the magazines. You know, if you do that, we'll give them free to our residents. So we're looking at that model because the advertising model will be broken for a fair while, I think.
New York City without theater was once unimaginable, but on March 13th, Governor Cuomo's orders canceled gatherings of more than 500 people, effectively turning the lights out on Broadway, a $2 billion sector. Soon after, smaller gatherings were ordered closed, silencing the stages of off-Broadway shows as well. Hell's Kitchen has more off-Broadway theaters than any other New York City neighborhood. The artistic director of one of those theaters, Intar, told us about canceling his productions and the uncertainty of when the shows would go back on.
Part of the magic of theater is being confined in a closed space with strangers to witness intimate moments depicted by live human beings. My name is Lou Moreno. I am the artistic director of Intar Theater, or International Arts Relations, INT. The name was coined in 1966 when they were founding it. Max Ferrat was the founder of Intar Theater, and Max Ferrat believed that there needed to be a space exclusive to Latino artists that were existing and thriving in New York City but didn't have the proper access to production at the level that he knew we should be at. All too many times, we're the ones that are asked to tell the immigration story, the crossing the border story. You know, whenever there's a Latino story in the news, they come to us and we have to then explain our Latinidad to the white audience. It's been my mission since I've been the artistic director for the last 10 years to forget about those stories and just let our artists dream and tell the stories of their dreams. We were in production for J. Julian Christopher's play Bundle of Sticks that I actually had directed. Bundle of Sticks is a play about 5 cisgendered men who go to gay conversion therapy run by a homophobic, closeted psychopath. And it was all played by women and non-binary actors. We were in week 3 of a 5-week run, so we had to close out the show with 2 weeks to go. It had become evident to us in that last week. We had a very funny show, which usually sells tickets pretty easily. Tickets were people just weren't coming. And then they began to shut down New York City and they shut down Broadway. So we shut down the show. We paid all of our actors through their contract. We thought that was important. We're not going to be able to remount the show. It's just financially, that's an impossibility for us. Because of the way union contracts work, we can't do a full 9 weeks of production again. I don't know when we'll bring audiences back in. I think we'll begin to bring actors and directors back in probably August, September. We cannot produce plays unless we have a undistracted audience. So I mean, in TAR, you are about, if you're in the front row, you can touch our actors. Like it's that, you are that on top of each other. Not that anybody should ever touch our actors. Am I not going to be able to tell stories of love when actors need to be able to kiss on stage? That terrifies me. Or not terrifies me, it deeply saddens me, you know, that we cannot ever experience human connection in a theater without 6 feet of distance. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a very, very different world.
According to the Department of Health, 1 in 5 New Yorkers have symptoms of mental illness. That number continues to grow considerably due to the threat of COVID-19. Matt Kudish is the executive director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in New York City, or NAMI NYC. His organization has continued to provide remote support to New Yorkers dealing with mental illness.
NAMI NYC has been around for nearly 40 years, and we started truly as a grassroots organization. Parents of young people who were struggling with mental health challenges came together around a kitchen table and said, there's nothing out there for us, and so we've got to figure out how to help each other and do it ourselves. And truly, out of that kitchen table conversation, NAMI was born. Last year, we served over 19,000 New Yorkers through our free programs and services. NAMI NYC has been affected by the pandemic in some pretty serious ways. Our office is located in Midtown Manhattan in Hell's Kitchen, and we stopped working out of the office on March 12th. Within 2 days, our helpline was up and running, operational, even though we were all working remotely from home. And so while we haven't been able to come together and be together in the same way we're used to, this situation has forced us to create new ways to create community. And so recognizing that we need to use the telephone and we need to use video technology has really taught us new ways to reach people and connect with people, even in the midst of a crisis like this. And so it's always really difficult work. But when you layer on the pandemic, it becomes much more challenging. We're even going to be expanding the days that we offer our helpline. We have classes, educations, support groups. We're offering public education meetings. Since the pandemic, we've seen a significant increase in the volume of calls that we're getting on our helpline. In the last 2 weeks of March, we saw a 60% jump in the number of calls based on the data from the previous months. And that increase has been holding pretty steady. I think we are seeing definitely a new level of anxiety, a new level of stress and worry. We're hearing from people who maybe never had to deal with these issues before and are all of a sudden experiencing feelings and don't know if it's okay or what's normal. We're absolutely seeing an increase in calls from people who are expressing feeling isolated and alone. And I think underserved communities, especially communities at risk, are potentially dealing with isolation in more profound ways than others. If you think about members of the LGBT community, we are far more likely to experience mental health challenges than members of other communities. And so I think we're seeing folks dealing with social isolation that perhaps they were already dealing with in some ways. We're also seeing people reach out who have been connected to NAMI NYC for long periods of time, people who have a history of dealing with mental health challenges. And for them, maybe their situation had been maintained. They were doing well before, but now the pandemic has brought up a resurgence of those symptoms, so they're reaching back out for support. And we're seeing people who are living with serious mental illness who are worried about getting the treatment that they need. How do I find a provider when I can't actually be in the office with somebody? What's going to happen if my medications run out? Is this pandemic making my symptoms worse? We started a group that we call Wellness Chat. And it's every Friday afternoon, and it's free like all our other programs and services. And it's just an opportunity for people to connect. And you can come in via video, you can call in on the telephone. We just wanted to create a place where it's not necessarily some of the other more specific groups or classes that we have. It's just a general group for people who want to connect, talk about what's going on, talk about how what's going on is affecting them, and share tips and strategies to cope. I think we're starting to see that. People are willing to talk about the mental health toll that this pandemic is having on them. And maybe we'll start to see mental illness talked about in the same way we talk about physical illnesses, giving it the same attention and continuing to reduce the stigma that so often gets in the way of people in need of services and support, finding access to those services and supports.
Adjacent to Hell's Kitchen is one of the world's most famous neighborhoods, Times Square. Known to be the crowded tourism center of New York, foot traffic is down in that area from an estimated 400,000 daily to just 30,000. And more than 2/3 of the hotels in the area are closed. We spoke to the Times Square Alliance president, Tim Tompkins, about the way forward.
Even though Times Square itself geographically represents like literally 0.1% of the entire city's landmass, a study was done in now about 4 years ago that showed about 15% of the overall city's economic activity directly or indirectly comes from Times Square. Times Square has always had a really disproportionate economic effect. The Times Square Alliance is really a souped up neighborhood organization, but it happens to be for the theater district in Times Square. Our boundaries cover what was really where the Broadway theaters are. So from 40th Street up to 53rd Street, just west of 6th Avenue to the west side of 8th Avenue plus Restaurant Row. We were started in the early 90s by a combination of the New York Times and the theater owners, because for decades there had been these big plans to make Times Square better. And Times Square, in fact, at that time was one of the most dangerous places, not only in New York City, but in the whole country. There literally is not a major news outlet in the world that hasn't, when they wanted to talk about what's going on in New York, posted a picture of an empty Times Square, because we're always representing whatever the normal is. And it may be a crazy normal at times, but right now it's this disturbing, sort of surreal, still New York. I think it's a question for New York City overall is how resilient can it be? And I think that just during my lifetime, there's been 3 times when New York City itself was written off. There was the late 70s when Ford to New York dropped dead, the city was bankrupt. Then there was the 80s and the 90s when, because of the crime wave, people just thought that New York City was dying, that people were fleeing to the suburbs. And then after 9/11, people forget that in 2002, when I started in this job, there were really serious questions about whether New York City would survive, whether people would just flee the city. And I think New York is nothing if not resilient. We have been doing an art project with the screens of Times Square to celebrate using artists' work, essential workers. And phase 2 of it is celebrating, in particular, immigrants who are sort of the invisible, unfortunately, people who are often made invisible or forced to be invisible because of many of our country's policies. And so we're doing a collaboration with the New York Immigration Coalition and also this group called For Freedoms that celebrates often unseen and unacknowledged people that are part of the workforce and part of the economy. And I hope that one of the things that grows out of the awfulness of this pandemic is that there's a greater appreciation for the people who are often, made to be invisible or are less visible, especially undocumented workers who keep New York City running. We're realistic that we're going to be a little later in the process because Times Square, if nothing else, represents people gathering together, whether it's New Year's Eve or going to a restaurant or going to a show or going to a political rally or demonstration in Times Square. It's fundamentally this place where people gather, and it's this point of intersection. And so people are understandably wary about those exact circumstances. So I think that, again, we may lag a little bit in terms of the pace of coming back. And part of what we have to do is send the signal that we're doing this carefully and thoughtfully as we come back.
Finally from us, we're going to move a little bit beyond Hell's Kitchen. New Yorkers have a long history of rising to challenges born out of natural disasters, or man-made ones for that matter. They did so during 9/11, and again after Superstorm Sandy. Many are doing so yet again. Gary Pierre tells us about the mutual aid movement that has grown out of this latest crisis.
Before the coronavirus pandemic, Imani Henry was a Brooklyn community organizer advocating for criminal and social justice reforms. Now, Henry, the founder and lead organizer of Equality for Flatbush, and his team spend their days raising funds, buying groceries, and checking in on cooped-up New Yorkers coping with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic.
The next piece of it is the emergency fund, as well as the community kits of food and supplies. We do unperishable food. That is definitely something that we're looking to do long-term and have to raise money. We definitely have spent probably close to $14,000 in 3 weeks just on food. We try to do an ample amount of 2 bags of groceries of non-perishables and other supplies like masks and gloves, disinfectant.
Equality for Flatbush is not alone. They are part of a legion of more than 100 community organizations that have been providing resources and services to those in dire need. Those groups are working under the umbrella organization Mutual Aid NYC that caught the attention of Abigail Savitch-Lew. Lew is a freelance journalist who wrote an article about the mutual aid movement for the nonprofit news organization City Limits.
I was noticing in my email inbox just all these different groups that I follow were basically talking about how they were launching mutual aid projects, and they were telling their listservs, their networks, get involved in our mutual aid initiative, our mutual aid project. And I hadn't really, I'd only vaguely heard that term before. And it was interesting that all these groups were saying that. And so I began to look more into what it meant and what these groups were doing exactly and why they were calling it mutual aid.
Savitch-Lew found a movement typical of New Yorkers, just as they did after 9/11 and Superstorm Sandy.
The whole idea with the word mutual aid is it's emphasizing people's interconnectivity and their willingness to cooperate. And sometimes it's also communities that are groups of people who are often marginalized people. So for instance, racial justice groups who are coming together, and they are Black racial justice activists helping other Black racial justice activists, or Black people helping other Black people, or it could be within a tenant union, members of this community helping each other.
While the workload is heavy, Henry says that he's honored to be part of this movement.
I am more touched and more proud of being part of that tradition and amplifying that tradition.
For DiverseCITY, I'm Gary Pierre.
As we end this month, it would be remiss of us if we didn't acknowledge the massive Black Lives Matter protest happening in many of the communities that we cover. We're going to leave you in a few moments with some of those scenes. But before that, on behalf of the entire team, I'm Savitch-Lew, wishing you and your entire family good health.